I want to do a quick walk around video to show folks the progress of the plane and how it's going. You can tell the airframe is pretty well done. The wings still need to be attached. There's one of them over along the wall there. The other is over at the airport waiting to get stuck on this guy. Other than that, the airframe is pretty well finished and we've got the engine mounted now. This is a 120 horsepower Corvair engine because it's been upgraded to about 3 liters. Took the engine up to Roy's garage in Michigan. Roy Serfinski does work on Corvairs specifically for converting them to flight engines. This engine had about 150 hours on it as a 2750 Corvair on a 601HD airframe, and I bought the whole firewall forward from the guy when he disassembled his airplane and sold it for parts. There wasn't any wreck damage or anything like that on the engine, at least not from what I was told, but I went ahead and tore it down anyway because I wanted to upgrade it to the larger cylinders. I wanted to go ahead and magnaflux the crank since it did not have a 5th bearing on the front of it when I got it, and did a few other modifications to it to get it to the condition where it is today. So I sent it up to Roy. He milled the heads and the case out for the 3-liter pistons, which are in there now. You can tell they're a little bit different shape than the standard Corvair cylinders because these came out of a VW and they're modified to fit. The starter I modified myself. It's a Subaru starter, and I modified it to be a little bit lower profile to fit underneath the cowling. The starter brackets I made myself. Those are available from William Wynn for about $100, but I did a few things to try to save some money here, and that was one of them. The ring gear is another thing that I made myself. This prop hub came with the engine when I got it. Behind the prop hub here, the silver housing that you see there, that's what Roy makes. That is for what's called a 5th bearing. It's a large bearing surface that goes right behind the prop hub on the crankshaft and takes out a lot of the torsional loads that the propeller puts on the crankshaft. And that's something that's been done over the last 4 or 5 years, it seems, to help these things be a little bit more safe in flight and protect from crank breaks. We did end up replacing the crank from the one that was in here when I purchased it because when it was magnafluxed it showed a couple of folds in the forging that were concerning to him, and so we replaced it with one that had really good journal radiuses and had been polished up really nicely and nitrided by Moldex. The heads are modified with the welded on intakes. This intake was done by the guy I bought the engine from. I believe he welded it himself, and I think it's aluminum rather than stainless steel, which is what Williams intakes are, but it seems to work okay. There's no problem with that. The alternator has a rear coupling that's made by SPA, the folks who make the Panther aircraft, and doesn't have the pulley on the front like some of the Corvairs that you see, and so it does have to spin at a little higher RPM. It doesn't really make its full output unless you're really into the cruise RPM range. But with the electrical system on this plane, that shouldn't be a problem because it's really not a high draw electrical system. It's fairly simple. And I am using an MA3 SPA carburetor, like is recommended in the Fly Corvair manual. It's got the accelerator pump on it, and so it doesn't need any priming or anything like that. So that's down there. Right now there's just an air filter from a Continental stuck on there so we could do the run outside because I haven't got my cowling yet. I've got the nose bowl, but the sheet metal for the cowling that comes with the air box hasn't come in from the Westmans. I went ahead and ordered that. I did not order this baffling from them. I went ahead and made all that myself, just going off of pictures. Frankly, it's probably one of the things I'm the most proud of on the airplane since there were no plans or anything to work off of. I just had to come up with it myself, do a lot of fitting with the nose bowl in place, and I don't even have a brake. Was able to do all these bends and everything without a brake, and I'm somewhat pleased with how that turned out. This is the rat's nest of wiring. I've tried to keep as neat as possible. There's still a little bit of bundling that needs to be done and some clamps that need to be put on there, but for the most part, this is all finished except for the trim wiring for the wings that I'll need to put on there when the wings are installed. The fuse boxes are over along the wall there. They should be accessible from inside with flashlight without taking the cover off that's going to cover all of this up. There's a separate fuse box for the ignition and fuel pumps there, and these are the ignition coils. There are 2 coils because there's 2 sets of points in the distributor cap. There's also 2 fuel pumps down in the firewall there, and that's so that I've got a fully redundant ignition and fuel system, and it's all controlled by a switch that's here on the dash. And what we'll do is open this up and show you the instrument panel setup that we have in here. We've got a mixture gauge operated with the left hand over here. This is a Toston grip. It's got trim controls for fore and aft as well as roll trim on it, and then a push-to-talk switch in the trigger. That's only going to be on the pilot side. I'll just put a simple grip on the passenger side, perhaps a push-to-talk switch over there, but I may wait until a little bit later to do that just to get this in the air as quickly as possible. I've got a tablet that's going to go on here, and the tablet does have a magnetometer. I need to check in and find out whether that's going to be sufficient to qualify as a compass. I may end up having to put a wet compass, on top of the dash or something. And then we've got our basic altitude, airspeed, and TAC, as well as a flight line radio there. And that's the throttle. From the throttle position, the pilot can have his hand on the throttle and start the plane with the start button, flip the ignition from one side to the other without taking his hand off the throttle, and also control the flaps with the thumb there. So that there's very little range of motion needed to control everything that you would need to control for landing. Even having the backup ignition really close by, so you don't have to take your hand off the throttle for that. And then these are all the instrument gauges that are pretty typical. The knobs above there are turnable, and what they do is they select different cylinders to check the exhaust gas temperature on those cylinders. The cylinder head has 2 different sensors, and I just put them underneath each head in the boss provided by GM. And so I've only got 2 cylinder head temperatures, but I have 6 EGT sensors, and so those are selectable with those 2 switches. Each one controls one side of the engine and can rotate through 3 positions. There are 2 fuel gauges here, the fuel selector. You can tell the red fluid is brake fluid. That's in all of the brake hoses that go. Those have been plumbed, and the emergency brake is right here. And well, that'll work a solenoid that's in the back there. So you can see it's pretty well done. Got a few things left to do, a couple of months worth of tidying up, put the wings on and rig them, and get ready to go. I was pleased with the engine run the other day. The engine ran at about 2700, 2750, full static RPM. We checked the timing with a light, and I got 32 degrees of advance at well, I don't know exactly when it came in because I wasn't in the cockpit when I was checking it, but it was in before the static had been reached. I'm going to run it again a little bit. We need to check compression on the cylinders and make sure that those are okay. It was run for the break-in without the oil cooler hooked up to try to get the oil temperature up. It was about a 20-degree day, and it probably took a good 10 minutes just to get the oil temperature up to about 100 degrees. The fuel pressure gauge is not working. I need to work on that a little bit, but oil pressure was fine. It started at about 25 psi and then moved up to about 40 psi when I was in an accelerated throttle position. I don't know the exact RPM that was, and everything else is working okay except for one of my EGT gauges consistently read about 400 degrees cooler than the other. So I switched all the wires, checked the other side of the engine, and the gauge read 400 degrees cooler on the same side still. So it's definitely a problem with the gauge because both of the sides of the engine on the working side of the gauge read what they ought to. It was somewhere between 12 and 1300 degrees, and that's after checking all 6 cylinders on the good side of the gauge. So we'll figure that out. Anyway, appreciate you taking the time to look.